For over 1,000 years, the Irish fought for independence against wave after wave of invaders trying to claim their beautiful island. From Viking raiders with blood-soaked axes to English knights in gleaming armour, everyone wanted Ireland for themselves. Through it all, the Irish people somehow survived, living in the shadow of foreign powers while keeping their culture alive. Here's what life was really like in ancient and medieval Ireland. Hey, quick thing before we start. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at, so comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in London while I'm recording this at night here in the States. Okay, tonight it's medieval Ireland. But hold up, get comfortable first. I mean it. Fix your pillows, grab that blanket. This one's worth settling in for. Your eyes open to darkness. Dawn hasn't broken yet. The smoke-filled air inside your tiny one-room house stings your lungs as you blink away sleep. You're curled up on a scratchy wool blanket spread over fresh rushes on the dirt floor. No fancy beds here. You sleep with your entire family in this small space. Your back aches from another night on the hard ground. Morning already? You groan, knowing no one will answer because everyone's still asleep. The dew-dampened thatch roof drips occasionally onto the dirt floor. In the corner, the small pile of peat that serves as your family's cooking fire has nearly died out overnight. Just a few glowing embers remain. Better get it going again before everyone wakes up. You roll over, feeling every knot in your muscles. Unlike your comfy memory foam mattress right now, ancient Irish people slept on whatever they could find. Straw, rushes, or just blankets on packed earth if they were lucky. Outside, mist hangs heavy over the green hills. You're in a ring fort, a circular settlement surrounded by earthen walls and wooden palisades. About 20 families live here together for protection. You need those walls. Raiders could come any time. Another day of still being alive, you mutter to yourself. Let's see how long that lasts. Okay, picture this. It's around 500 CE, and Ireland is nothing like the country we know today. No cities, no central government, just hundreds of tiny kingdoms scattered across the island. The Celts who settled here became known as Gaels, developing their own distinct culture. I spent way too much time researching ancient Irish political systems for this, like concerningly long, but it's fascinating. The land was divided into about 150 tiny kingdoms called tuatha. Each was basically the territory owned by a single tribe. Wait, 150 kingdoms on one small island? That seems excessive. Exactly. Each kingdom had its own king called a rí, but it gets better. If a king managed to control several tuatha, he became a king of tribes, or rí Biden. The really powerful ones ruled entire provinces and earned the title king over kings, or rí Ruirec. And at the very top there was the High King, or Ard Rí, who, well, to be honest, didn't actually have much real power over the whole island. It was more of a symbolic title that kings fought over constantly. So basically, Ireland had more kings than convenience stores in a modern city. Pretty much archaeological evidence shows that the ancient capital was at Tara, named after a sacred hill. I've seen the place. Standing there, looking out over the countryside, you can almost feel the history. A historian I interviewed said the Irish had so many kings that if you threw a rock in any direction, you'd probably hit one. She wasn't entirely joking. The morning light finally breaks over the hills. Your stomach is already growling. Breakfast is simple. A bowl of porridge made from oats with maybe some milk if your family's cow is producing. No coffee, no sugar, no toast. Just bland, filling food to get you through the day. Imagine starting your day without that morning coffee or tea. Wild, right? Instead, you drink water from the nearby stream, sometimes clear, sometimes not so much. Nothing like a cup of potentially disease-filled water to start the day, you think as you take a reluctant sip. For most regular folks, life was pretty rough. You're a farmer, just like almost everyone else. Your days revolve around tending cattle, growing oats and barley, and trying not to die from disease, injury, or the occasional raid from a neighbouring kingdom. Plot twist, it gets worse. The Irish climate is cool and wet, great for growing grass, terrible for growing enough grains. Cattle were everything. They provided milk, occasionally meat, though you rarely slaughtered them because live cows were more valuable, and served as the main form of wealth. No banks, no stocks, no 401k, just cows. So you're saying my retirement plan would have been cows? Exactly. The more cattle you had, the wealthier you were. People even paid fines and taxes in cows. Kings measured their power by how many cattle raids they successfully pulled off against neighbouring kingdoms. Speaking of raids, that constant political fragmentation I mentioned, that was Ireland's biggest weakness. These tiny kingdoms were constantly fighting each other over cattle, land, or just because someone looked at someone else funny. You're probably thinking, why didn't they just unite against common enemies? They tried, they just weren't very good at it. Alliances formed and broke apart faster than modern celebrity relationships. An Irish king might team up with his neighbour one day, then raid his cattle the next. No, but seriously, this is why Ireland had such a hard time against foreign invaders. While the rest of Europe was gradually forming larger political units, Ireland remained divided into these mini-kingdoms that spent more time fighting each other than external threats. The Druids were a big deal back then. These weren't the flower crown-wearing, tree-hugging types you might imagine. They were highly educated religious leaders, legal authorities, and keepers of knowledge. Training to be a Druid took about 20 years, basically the equivalent of getting multiple PhDs. Wait, so they were like ancient lawyers, priests, and professors all rolled into one? Yep. And people were terrified of them. They could literally declare someone an outcast, which was basically a death sentence in a society where you needed your community to survive. Unlike Britain, Ireland never experienced a Roman invasion. The Roman governor in Britain Agricola apparently considered it, but the Romans had enough trouble controlling Britain. They looked at Ireland across the water and basically went, yeah, no thanks. There's evidence of Roman trading posts and contacts, though. Archaeologists found a Roman settlement on the banks of the River Nore that was probably a trading centre. Romans called the Irish Scotti, a term whose meaning nobody really agrees on. Some think it meant raiders, others say wanderers. Around the 5th century, everything changed when Christianity arrived. The main man associated with this is, of course, St. Patrick, though he wasn't actually the first missionary to Ireland. Hold up, so St. Patrick wasn't Irish, and he didn't actually drive snakes out of Ireland. Nope, Patrick was a Romano-British dude who was kidnapped by Irish raiders as a teenager, escaped after 6 years, became a priest, and then returned to convert the people who had enslaved him. Talk about forgiveness. And the snake thing, pure metaphor. Ireland never had snakes in the first place because of the Ice Age. The snakes he drove out were probably meant to represent pagan beliefs or druids. The cool thing about Irish Christianity is how it absorbed local pagan traditions. Some Celtic gods just became saints. Pagan festivals became Christian holy days. The Celtic cross? That's a Christian cross superimposed on a sun symbol. There's a diary from an Irish monk in the 7th century that describes how people would still leave offerings at sacred wells even after converting to Christianity. These people were hedging their bets. I'll go to Mass on Sunday, but I'm still leaving milk for the fairies just in case. Meanwhile, Ireland's geography shaped everything. The island is ringed with mountains and hills with a central plain. Rivers provided transportation highways, and the countless bays and inlets along the coast would later prove perfect for raiders to slip in unnoticed. By now, the sun is high in the sky. Your day is spent tending cattle, repairing fences, or working in the small plot where your family grows oats and vegetables. The work is back-breaking. No machines, no power tools, just your hands, a wooden spade, and maybe an ox if your family is prosperous enough. Your fingers are cracked and calloused. Your back constantly aches. Honestly, modern gym workouts have nothing on the full-body endurance test that was just staying alive in medieval Ireland. Midday meal is more porridge, maybe with some wild greens if you're lucky. Meat is rare unless it's a special occasion. Most protein comes from milk, cheese, and occasionally fish if you live near the coast or a river. The social structure was complex but rigid. At the top were the kings and nobles. Then came the freemen with their own land. Below them were the semi-free, people who had some rights but were dependent on others. At the bottom were slaves, often captives from raids, or people who fell into debt. So, where would I fit in this society? If you're listening to this on your smartphone in a comfortable bed, you'd probably be a slave back then. Just kidding. But seriously, most people were in the middle categories, neither completely free nor unfree. The ancient Irish had their own written language. Ogham. It wasn't used for books or everyday writing, but for monuments and boundary markers. It consisted of lines carved along the edge of stone pillars. One historian described it to me as the world's most inconvenient way to write a text message. Women had more rights in ancient Ireland than in many contemporary societies. They could own property, get divorced for various reasons, including if their husband was too fat to perform his marital duties. I'm not making this up. And some even became warriors. Wait, women could divorce men for being too fat? That's oddly specific. The legal texts literally list it as grounds for divorce. The ancient Irish were nothing if not practical. One of the most interesting aspects of early Irish society were the fianna, independent bands of warriors celebrated in legends. Think of them as a cross between knights-errant, mercenaries, and vigilante groups who supposedly protected ordinary folks from the tyranny of corrupt rulers. By late afternoon, dark clouds gather on the horizon. Rain is coming, because of course it is. This is Ireland, after all. You hurry to finish your work before the downpour. Inside your house, the central hearth provides both warmth and light as evening falls. The smoke escapes through a hole in the roof, most of it anyway. The rest fills the single room, making your eyes water and throat itch. But you're used to it. Everyone is. Dinner is, surprise, more porridge, maybe flavoured with herbs, possibly some cheese on the side. If it's a feast day, there might be meat. The wealthy eat better, more meat, honey, and imported luxuries like wine. As darkness falls completely, storytelling begins. This is how history, legends, and practical knowledge are passed down in a world without TV, internet, or even books for most people. Oral tradition is everything. The tales often feature heroes like Cú Chulainn or Finn McCool, magical beings, epic battles, and moral lessons. These stories aren't just entertainment. They contain the collective wisdom and identity of the people. Tell us about the cattle raid of Cooley again, the children beg. These stories would last hours, keeping people entertained through the long, dark evenings. The best storytellers were highly respected and could travel between communities, welcomed everywhere for their skills. As night deepens, the rain patters on the thatch roof. The fire dies down to embers. Everyone in the house gradually falls asleep in their spots around the hearth, huddled together for warmth. Lying there in the darkness, listening to the breathing of your family around you, you wonder what tomorrow will bring. Another day like today, probably. The rhythm of life is predictable, built around seasons and survival, but change is coming to Ireland. Big change. In the centuries ahead, a new threat will appear on the horizon. Strange ships with dragon-headed prows and fierce warriors wielding axes. The Vikings are coming, and they're about to turn Ireland upside down. For now, though, you close your eyes, grateful to have survived another day in a world where nothing is guaranteed. Unlike you in your warm, comfortable bed with clean sheets and zero threat of Viking raiders, ancient Irish folks lived with constant uncertainty. The medieval Irish actually had a saying that translates roughly to 3 things to be grateful for: a full belly, a warm fire, and a roof that doesn't leak too much. Perspective, right? And while you drift off to sleep in your ring fort on a night over 1,500 years ago, we'll pick up this story tomorrow with the arrival of those Viking ships and the chaos they brought to the emerald shores of Ireland. Actually, not tomorrow, because this isn't a multi-night story. We're just getting started on our journey through Irish history. The Vikings are about to change everything. The morning silence shatters with screams. You bolt upright from your sleeping spot, heart hammering against your ribs. Outside, people are running, shouting. The warning horn blares from the watchtower. Raiders Vikings at the shore. The year is 795, and everything is about to go to absolute hell. Strange ships with dragon-headed prows have appeared off the coast of Lambay Island. They're like nothing the Irish have ever seen before. Sleek, fast vessels designed for both deep-sea travel and navigating shallow rivers. The perfect raiding craft. You grab your few precious possessions and rush outside. The ring fort is in chaos. Men grab whatever weapons they can find, mostly farming tools. Women gather children. Elders pray. Are we fighting or running? Someone shouts. Good question. Against these warriors from the north, neither option looks promising. The Viking raids on Ireland began in 795 when they attacked and plundered a monastery on Lambay Island. But that was just the appetizer. In the following years, they hit Ulster and Connacht, and by 820, they'd looted nearly the entire coastline of Ireland. The crazy part is how far these guys travelled. A museum guide once told me off the record they didn't have GPS or proper maps. They navigated by the stars, landmarks, and sometimes just gut feeling. Imagine sailing across the open ocean in basically a fancy rowboat with a big sail, hoping you'd eventually hit land somewhere. The Irish called the Vikings Gael, which just means foreigner, probably the politest thing they called them considering the circumstances. Here's the thing about Viking raids. They weren't just random attacks. These guys were methodical. They specifically targeted monasteries and religious settlements, not because they had anything against Christianity, but because that's where the good stuff was. So wait, they travelled thousands of miles just to rob churches. Yep, monasteries were like medieval banks. They stored valuable items, gold chalices, silver crosses, jeweled gospel books. Plus, they usually had food stockpiles and weren't heavily defended. Easy pickings. And monks? Monks made excellent slaves. They were educated, could read and write, and would fetch a high price in the slave markets back home. So it wasn't just about the bling. It was a complete resource grab. The Viking longships could carry about 60 warriors each. Picture this, you're peacefully tending your cattle one morning and suddenly 5 to 10 ships appear offshore. That's 300, 600 heavily armed, battle-hardened warriors charging at your settlement. In a time when most Irish people were farmers who occasionally had to fight, they were up against professional warriors who lived for battle. Not exactly a fair matchup. You'd think someone would have figured out how to stop them. Oh, people tried. The Irish would light warning beacons, sound horns, or send runners to alert nearby settlements. But Vikings were fast. They'd be on you before most people could respond. I interviewed a Viking reenactor once who told me a fit crew could row a longship at about 10 knots. That's roughly 11 miles per hour. They could hit a beach, raid, and be back on their ships in under an hour. The morning of a raid, chaos reigns. People grab whatever they can carry. Food, tools, precious items. Everyone runs for the hills, the forests, the bogs, anywhere the Viking ships can't reach. You help an elderly neighbour who's moving too slowly, practically dragging her toward the tree line. Behind you, smoke rises from the first buildings the raiders have torched. The screams of those who couldn't escape fast enough echo across the fields. Don't look back, you tell yourself. Just keep moving. The worst part, this same scene will repeat itself dozens of times over the next few decades. The Vikings aren't just passing through, they're here to stay. In 837, a massive Viking force led by a king named Turgesius arrived in Ireland. This wasn't just a raid, it was an invasion. Historians aren't actually sure who Turgesius was exactly. He's not mentioned in any Scandinavian sagas, which is weird for such an important figure. Some think he might have been a Norwegian chieftain named Thorgils. Others suggest he was a composite character representing several Viking leaders. Either way, the Irish chronicles give us plenty of details about his bloody campaign. He smashed his way into Ulster and captured Armagh, the centre of Christianity in Ireland. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological and spiritual blow to the Irish. The Vikings didn't just loot the cathedral. According to chronicles, they performed sacrifices to Odin on the ruins of the Christian altar. They were sending a message: your God can't protect you from our gods. Jesus. That's some hardcore psychological warfare. Exactly. After destroying Armagh, Turgesius didn't leave. Instead, he sailed south and settled with his forces at the mouth of the River Liffey in 840. There, the Vikings built their first permanent settlement, which they named Dublin, in Irish Dublin, meaning Black Pool. Dublin wasn't built to be a beautiful city. It was a fortified trading post and military base. From there, Turgesius launched raids deeper into the island, using the rivers as highways. The Vikings' shallow draft longships could navigate inland waterways that larger vessels couldn't, giving them access to settlements that thought they were safe from seaborne raiders. So basically, nowhere was safe. Pretty much. If you lived near any body of water bigger than a puddle, you were a potential target. People started building homes farther from rivers and coasts, even if it meant harder access to water and trade. During one of his raids, Turgesius encountered the king of Mede, Mael Secnail Prefer. And this is where one of my favourite stories from Irish history comes in. According to legend, the Irish king asked the Viking king what should be done about troublesome birds living nearby. Turgesius, thinking this was a legitimate question about pest control, advised the king to destroy their nests. Mael Secnail was like, "Great advice, thanks." Then that night, the Irish launched a surprise attack on the Viking camp, killing them all. Turgesius was captured and, according to some accounts, executed by drowning, a particularly insulting death for a Viking who believed warriors should die in battle with weapons in hand to reach Valhalla. Wait, so the birds were the Vikings? It was a coded conversation. Mael Secnail was basically asking, "How should I get rid of you annoying Vikings?" And Turgesius unwittingly gave him the perfect strategy: attack their camps while they were sleeping. Classic. I found a translation of an old Irish text where a chronicler wrote, "Thus did the king of Mede use the foreigner's own wisdom against him, sending him to the bottom of Lough Owel with stones tied to his feet." No songs of Valhalla for this one. Medieval people had a dark sense of humour. After this victory, Mael Sechnaill focused on expelling the Vikings from the island, defeating their armies in several battles. He even received the title of High King of Ireland, becoming the first king whose existence is actually confirmed in reliable chronicles. But, and this is a recurring theme in Irish history, political fragmentation still played a role. Mael Sechnaill had to fight not just against the Vikings, but also against other Irish kings. These internal conflicts prevented the Irish from uniting effectively against the Scandinavian invaders. So they're still fighting each other even with Vikings slaughtering everyone. That's not great strategic thinking. I know, right? But put yourself in their position. These kingdoms had been rivals for centuries. Trust was non-existent. Each king was thinking, sure, the Vikings are bad, but if I help my traditional enemy defeat them, what's stopping him from turning on me next? Plus, some Irish kings actually saw the Vikings as potential allies against their local rivals. Classic enemy of my enemy thinking. In 853, Dublin was captured by a new Viking leader, King Olaf the White, or as the Irish chronicles called him, King Amlaíb. He became the first official king of Dublin. Olaf was ambitious. He wasn't content just holding Dublin. He began raiding both inland Ireland and Great Britain. His biggest raid was in 870 when he plundered the Welsh kingdom of Strathclyde. After Olaf died, power passed to his companion, King Eamar, who modern historians believe was the semi-legendary Ivar the Boneless. If you've watched Vikings, you know this guy. In reality, he ruled for only a short time before dying in a skirmish with the Irish in 873. Hold up. Ivar the Boneless? What kind of name is that? Right? No one knows for sure where the nickname came from. Some think he had a medical condition like brittle bone disease, or perhaps was double-jointed and unusually flexible. Others suggest it was a mistranslation and should have been the Hated. Either way, despite his weird nickname, he was one of the most feared Viking leaders of his time. The descendants of Imar inherited the throne of Dublin and, interestingly, began to assimilate into Irish culture. The Viking settlers started adopting local customs, intermarrying with the Irish and creating a unique hybrid culture. The Kingdom of Dublin was small, but it had a powerful fleet that allowed it to project power across the island and intervene in any other kingdom's affairs. The city grew through trade and became the main port in Ireland. Life changes dramatically for the Irish during this period. Coastal settlements are abandoned or heavily fortified. Monasteries build round towers, tall, narrow structures with a single door high above ground level. When raiders approached, monks would grab their valuable manuscripts and relics, climb inside, pull the ladder up, and wait for the danger to pass. You can still see these towers all over Ireland today. They're like massive stone middle fingers to the Vikings saying, "Nice try, but we're keeping our stuff." Day-to-day survival takes on new dimensions. You learn to hide food and valuables in secret spots. Everyone becomes practiced at grabbing essential items and disappearing into the landscape at the first sign of trouble. Children are taught to be quiet, to run, to hide. Many Irish farms become more self-sufficient but poorer. Trade decreases because merchants fear travelling. Communities become more isolated. Knowledge and skills that once spread easily across regions now stay confined to smaller areas. Not all the Irish were content to just accept Viking presence on their island. The first serious attempt to expel them came from Cerbal MacMurachane, the king of Leinster. He united various Irish forces and in 902 AD captured Dublin, driving out the Viking settlers. But once again, unity didn't last. After the Vikings left, the Irish kings resumed fighting among themselves. When the Vikings returned 15 years later to retake Dublin, the Irish tried to stop them but suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Confey. The Vikings didn't just reclaim Dublin, they captured several new cities in Ireland, including Wexford, Waterford, Cork and Limerick. Each became a Viking stronghold and trading centre. It's like they just couldn't get their act together. Yeah, it's frustrating looking back, but that's the thing about history. Hindsight is 20/20. These kings weren't thinking about the fate of Ireland as a unified nation. That concept barely existed. They were focused on their own kingdoms, their own people, their own immediate problems. For the average person, daily life during the Viking Age was basically constant anxiety. Imagine living in a world where, at any moment, a ship could appear on the horizon and your whole life would be upended. The sound of a horn in the distance could mean you had minutes to decide what to take and where to run. The most valuable skill was not farming or crafting. It was knowing where the best hiding places were and how to reach them quickly. So it was basically a horror movie, but it lasted for generations, pretty much. And like any good horror movie, there's a twist. While the Vikings were raiding and pillaging, they were also trading and settling. They brought new technologies, new trade networks, and new bloodlines to Ireland. By evening, you're huddled with your community in a hidden cave. Children whimper quietly. Adults speak in whispers. From your hiding spot, you can see the distant glow of burning buildings. Your home is probably among them. Will they find us here? A child asks. No, you lie. With more confidence than you feel. They never come this far inland. But everyone knows that's not true anymore. The Vikings are venturing deeper with each raid. Nowhere feels truly safe. You spend a cold, uncomfortable night in the cave. By morning, the raiders have typically moved on, loaded with plunder and captives. Those who hid successfully return to their devastated homes and begin the work of rebuilding again. Some who lose everything in raids move inland, away from rivers and coasts. Others fortify their settlements, building stronger walls, deeper ditches. Communities establish warning systems, a chain of signal fires on hilltops, horseback messengers ready to ride at the first sign of sails on the horizon. Life adapts. It has to. The most surprising development? Some Irish actually begin to join Viking settlements, attracted by the trading opportunities and different way of life. Dublin grows into a proper town with a mix of Scandinavian and Irish residents. Archaeological digs have found Irish-style houses right next to Viking ones inside the walls of early Dublin. The Vikings introduced new shipbuilding techniques, new weapons, new trading networks reaching as far as Constantinople and the Middle East. Silver coins from Baghdad and silk from China make their way to Irish ports. The world, in a sense, becomes a little smaller. By the late 9th century, many of the Vikings in Ireland have never actually seen Scandinavia. They're born in Ireland, speak a mix of Norse and Irish, follow some blend of pagan and Christian practices, and consider themselves neither fully Viking nor fully Irish. They're something new, something that will eventually be called Norse Gaels or Hiberno-Norse. And just when it seems like this might be the new normal, Vikings controlling the coasts, Irish controlling the interior, everyone getting used to periodic violence interrupted by periods of trade, a new figure emerges who will challenge the established order. His name is Brian Boru, from the small kingdom of Thomond in what's now County Clare, and he's about to change the game completely. He swears to drive the Vikings from Ireland once and for all, but his story, his rise to power, his victories, and his famous last battle at Clontarf, that's where we'll pick up next. So, as night falls over Viking Age Ireland, with watchfires burning on the hills and sentries scanning the horizon for dragon-headed ships, we'll pause here. The greatest confrontation between Irish and Vikings is yet to come, and Brian Boru's story deserves our full attention. Dawn breaks over a small fortress in the kingdom of Thomond, in what's now County Clare. A man stands on the ramparts, watching the sunrise. He's not particularly imposing, middle-aged, with a beard streaked with grey. But his eyes burn with intensity. This is Brian Boru, and he's absolutely done with Vikings running wild across his homeland. Unlike your comfy life where the biggest threat is probably a late-night email from your boss, Brian's entire existence has been shaped by violence. When he was just a kid, Vikings killed his mother during a raid. Later, they murdered his father too. Now he's nursing a grudge the size of Ireland itself. "I will drive every last one of them into the sea," he mutters to himself, a daily promise that's become something of a personal mantra. Brian wasn't born into power. He came from the Dalkais, a minor clan from a region that wasn't exactly the centre of Irish politics. Think of him as a small-town politician suddenly deciding he's going to become president. The odds were not in his favour. But the guy had skills. He was smart, strategic, and had a talent for both fighting and politics, a rare combo that's pretty much the medieval equivalent of a superpower. So wait, this regular dude from nowhere just decided he was going to take on both the Vikings and all the other Irish kings. Bold strategy. Right? The audacity. But here's where Brian was different from previous Irish leaders. He had a long-term plan. He wasn't just reacting to Viking raids, he was systematically building power. His first move was consolidating control over Thomond, his home turf. Once that was secure, he set his sights on the entire province of Munster. This wasn't easy. The region had been dominated by the Eoganachta dynasty for centuries. I read an account from an old Irish manuscript where a rival king supposedly said, "Who does this Brian think he is? His father herded cattle and now he wants to rule Munster. Next, pigs will fly and fish will walk on land." That king didn't live long enough to eat his words, but eat them he would have. By 976, Brian had become King of Munster, controlling the southwestern quarter of Ireland. Now he could finally focus on his lifelong grudge, the Vikings. His first major move against them came at the Battle of Sulcoit in 968. The Vikings of Limerick had been a pain in everyone's side for years, raiding inland along the Shannon River. Brian gathered his forces and met them at Sulcoit. Now, medieval battles weren't like what you see in movies. They were messy, chaotic, and usually pretty brief. Most lasted less than an hour. Turns out humans can only hack at each other with sharp metal for so long before exhaustion sets in. So no epic day-long confrontations with dramatic speeches. Occasionally, but rarely, the Battle of Sulcoit was actually unusual because it did last most of the day. The Vikings initially held their ground, but Brian's forces eventually broke through their shield wall. Once that happened, it was game over. The Vikings, who could retreated to Limerick, but Brian wasn't finished. He pursued them, captured the city, and according to the chronicles, the fort was levelled, the women enslaved, all wealth seized, and the whole place burned. Message sent. Brian Boru was not messing around. This victory did more than just bloody the Vikings' noses. It gave Brian control of the valuable trading port of Limerick and sent a powerful message to both the remaining Viking settlements and to other Irish kings. There's a new player in town. For the average Irish person living through these events, life remained incredibly hard. Viking raids might be less frequent in areas Brian controlled, but agriculture was still backbreaking work. Disease was common and winters were brutal. Imagine waking up each day wondering not only if raiders might attack, but also if the harvest would be enough to avoid starvation, if that cough your child has might turn deadly, or if the local king's tax collectors would take so much you couldn't feed your family. Your house is still that one-room structure with a central hearth and a hole in the roof to let some of the smoke out. Your bed is still straw or rushes covered with animal skins. Your clothes are rough wool or linen that you probably spun and wove yourself. But there's one key difference. For the first time in generations, there's a sense that maybe, just maybe, the Vikings' grip on Ireland is weakening. In the years following his victory at Sulcoit, Brian continued expanding his power. He built a network of fortresses to secure his territories and established alliances with some Irish kings while subduing others. Was he just as bad as the Vikings then, conquering other Irish kingdoms? Good question. Brian's tactics could definitely be brutal, but there was a crucial difference. Brian wasn't interested in looting and leaving. He wanted to build a unified Ireland under his rule. Yes, he fought other Irish kings, but his goal was integration, not destruction. When he defeated a rival, he typically installed a loyal subordinate as ruler, rather than wiping out the local power structure completely. He was building something larger than just his personal kingdom. By the 980s, Brian had become powerful enough to challenge Mael Sechnaill II, the High King of Ireland. These two spent about 15 years fighting each other in a medieval political chess match. In 997, they finally reached an agreement. Brian would control the southern half of Ireland, while Mael Sechnaill kept the northern half. This was basically Ireland's version of the Treaty of Tordesillas, where Spain and Portugal divided the New World between them. But Brian wasn't satisfied with half a loaf. 2 years later, the Vikings of Dublin, allied with the Kingdom of Leinster, decided to test Brian's power. Big mistake, huge. Brian and Mael Sechnaill temporarily set aside their rivalry and joined forces against this threat. In the Battle of Glenmama in 999, their combined armies crushed the Dublin Vikings and their Leinster allies. Picture this scene. A cold winter day, the ground hard with frost. Thousands of men arranged in tight formations, breath visible in the chill air, battle standards fluttering in the wind, the silence before the charge, that moment when every warrior contemplates their mortality. Then the horns sound, and it all dissolves into chaos. After the victory, Brian's forces occupied Dublin, the most important Viking settlement in Ireland. According to chronicles, they carried away all the wealth and treasure of the fortress. Brian also took the Viking king's sister as his wife, because nothing says, "I've defeated you," quite like becoming your enemy's brother-in-law. Okay. That's some serious power move energy, right? Medieval politics was next-level petty sometimes. With Dublin under his control and his main Viking opponents humbled, Brian turned his attention back to his fellow Irishman, Mael Sechnaill. Through a combination of military pressure and political manoeuvring, Brian finally forced Mael Sechnaill to acknowledge him as the High King in 1002. This was a huge deal. Brian Boru had gone from being the leader of a minor clan to the High King of Ireland, a true medieval rags-to-riches story. More importantly, he was the first High King in generations who actually exercised real authority across most of the island. For about 12 years, Brian ruled Ireland with relative stability. He built churches and monasteries, repaired infrastructure damaged by decades of Viking raids, and sponsored scholarly works. One of his big projects was restoring the library at Armagh, which had been devastated during earlier Viking attacks. The chronicles describe him as Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Irish. Pretty impressive title for a guy whose father herded cattle. During these years, many Viking settlers in Ireland increasingly assimilated into Irish culture. They intermarried with the Irish, converted to Christianity, and in many cases became just another part of Irish society. Some even fought in Brian's armies. But not all Vikings were ready to play nice. In Dublin, resentment simmered. The Viking king of Dublin, Sitric Silkbeard, was technically Brian's vassal but chafed under Irish rule. He began secretly reaching out to Viking leaders abroad, looking for allies to help him throw off Brian's authority. In 1013, Sitric found his chance. A rebellion broke out in Leinster, an Irish kingdom that had never fully accepted Brian's rule. Sitric immediately joined forces with the rebels. So the Vikings and some Irish teamed up against other Irish? Man, medieval politics was a mess. Tell me about it. Alliances shifted faster than TikTok trends. Sitric went beyond just local allies, though. He sent messengers to the Viking settlements in the Orkney Islands, the Isle of Man, and even back to Scandinavia itself, calling for help against Brian. Viking warriors answered the call, eager for both battle and the prospect of loot. By spring of 1014, a substantial force had gathered in Dublin. The stage was set for the most famous battle in medieval Irish history. On Good Friday, April 23rd, 1014, two armies faced each other at Clontarf, just north of Dublin. On one side stood Brian Boru's forces, composed of his Munster troops and allied Irish kings. On the other side were the Dublin Vikings, their Leinster allies, and Viking mercenaries from across the Norse world. Brian was now in his 70s, too old to personally lead troops in battle. Instead, he remained in his tent behind the lines, praying while his son Murchad commanded the army. The Battle of Clontarf was no brief skirmish. It raged from sunrise to sunset, an unusually long battle for the time. According to chronicles, over 10,000 men died that day, including many leaders on both sides. Imagine the scene: the crash of shields, the screams of the wounded, banners fluttering above the chaos. The tide literally turned during the battle. Fought near the shore, the morning's low tide gave way to evening's high tide, washing blood and bodies out to sea. That's horrifically poetic. History is like that sometimes. As the sun began to set, it became clear that Brian's forces were winning. The Viking line broke, and they began fleeing back toward their ships or the safety of Dublin's walls. But in the chaos of victory, tragedy struck. A small group of Vikings fleeing the battlefield stumbled upon Brian's lightly guarded tent. Among them was a Viking leader named Brodir, who recognized the elderly High King. He rushed into the tent and killed Brian before the king's guards could stop him. So, in a cruel twist of fate, Brian Boru won his greatest victory against the Vikings, but didn't live to see it. He achieved his life's goal of breaking Viking power in Ireland, but paid for it with his life. Wait, he died at the moment of his greatest triumph? That's actually kind of epic. It really is. It's the kind of ending that would seem too on the nose in fiction, but somehow works perfectly in real history. After the battle, Brian's body was taken to Armagh, the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland, where he was buried with great honour. The chronicles describe a 12-day funeral where the clergy kept watch over his body and made constant prayer. So, what did the Battle of Clontarf actually achieve? Contrary to some romantic nationalist histories, it didn't end Viking presence in Ireland entirely. Dublin remained a Viking-controlled city, and Norse-Irish communities continued to exist in coastal towns. But it did mark the end of Viking military dominance. After Clontarf, the Vikings in Ireland became primarily traders rather than raiders. Their assimilation into Irish society accelerated. Within a few generations, many Viking settlements were practically indistinguishable from Irish ones, except for some architectural styles and trading practices. So it was more like a cultural tipping point than a total victory? Exactly. The Battle of Clontarf didn't eliminate Norse influence from Ireland. It transformed it from an external threat into an integrated part of Irish society. For ordinary people, the years following Clontarf brought some welcome stability. With fewer large-scale Viking raids, agricultural production improved, trade routes became more secure, and the constant fear of dragon-headed ships appearing on the horizon gradually faded. But if they thought Brian Boru's victory meant lasting peace for Ireland, they were sorely mistaken. After Brian's death, the position of High King was immediately contested. His son Mershad had died at Clontarf too, leaving a succession crisis. Ireland rapidly returned to its previous state of competing kingdoms without a strong central authority. And as daylight fades over the blood-soaked field of Clontarf, with Brian's body being prepared for its final journey to Armagh, the next chapter in Ireland's turbulent history is already beginning to unfold. Because while the Viking Age in Ireland was drawing to a close, a new threat was slowly taking shape across the Irish Sea. The English were rising in power, and their gaze would eventually turn toward the emerald shores of Ireland. The Vikings had been fearsome raiders, but they never had the organisation or numbers to conquer Ireland completely. The English would prove to be a very different kind of adversary. Brian Boru had united Ireland briefly through the force of his personality and military skill. Without him, that unity quickly dissolved. It would be more than 800 years before Ireland would be truly united again, and by then it would be under foreign rule. As night falls after the Battle of Clontarf, imagine yourself as an ordinary Irish person hearing the news. The great Brian Boru has defeated the Vikings but died in the moment of victory. There's relief that the immediate Viking threat has been blunted, but uncertainty about what comes next. You light a candle in your simple home, say a prayer for the fallen king, and wonder what the future holds. Will there be peace now? Will another strong leader emerge? Or will Ireland return to the old pattern of competing kingdoms? Little do you know that as you ponder these questions, the seeds of Ireland's next great struggle are already being sown. The Norman conquest of England is less than 50 years away, and once the Normans control England, their ambitious lords will begin looking to Ireland as their next frontier. But that's a story for another time. For now, as the embers of your hearth fire die down and you settle into your bed of straw, take comfort in the momentary peace following Clontarf. The Vikings have been defeated, and for the first time in generations, you can sleep without quite so much fear of raiders in the night. Unlike you in your comfortable bed with clean sheets and no threat of Viking axes, medieval Irish people savoured these rare moments of relative security, knowing how quickly they could vanish. Tonight, at least, there are no dragon ships on the horizon. You wake up to the sound of rain pattering on the thatched roof. It's been about a century since the Battle of Clontarf. Brian Boru is now a legend, a name invoked by Irish kings claiming legitimacy. The Vikings aren't gone, but they've changed. Less raid and pillage, more trade and settle. You roll over on your straw mattress, pulling a rough wool blanket tighter around your shoulders. The morning is cold and damp. Welcome to Ireland in the mid-12th century. Outside your window, Dublin is waking up. The city is still technically ruled by Viking descendants, but they're so mixed with the Irish now that most people just call them Hiberno-Norse, a fancy way of saying Irish Vikings. They dress like the Irish, speak a mix of languages, and most have converted to Christianity. So much for driving all Vikings into the sea, you mutter, thinking of Brian Boru's old vow. The weakened kingdom of Dublin wouldn't remain under Viking rule much longer. The last Scandinavian king of Dublin, a guy named Gofraid Olafsson, managed to hold power for only 3 years before the Irish finally took control. After that, an Irish dynasty called Uí Chenzalain ruling Dublin, though their grip was shaky at best. And this is where our story takes its next major turn with a dude named Diarmait mac Murchada. Who the hell is Diarmait mac Murchada? Fair question. The English called him Dermot MacMurrough, and he's one of those historical figures who changed everything, though not in a way that made him popular in Irish memory. In fact, some Irish histories basically paint him as the villain who lost Ireland. Diarmait became the king of Leinster at age 16 and immediately showed he was ambitious as hell. He wasn't content with just his inherited kingdom. He wanted to be High King of all Ireland, and he wasn't particularly picky about how he got there. Let me guess, he made some enemies along the way? Oh boy, did he ever. This guy collected enemies like some people collect stamps. His first major screw-up came in 1132 when he plundered the Abbey of Kildare, which was not only a holy site but also a major political centre. He was promptly kicked out of Leinster by rival clans. Somehow, he managed to reclaim his crown later that same year. The details are sketchy, but it probably involved a combination of military force, bribery, and political manoeuvring, the medieval royal trifecta. For about 20 years after that, Diarmait actually ruled pretty peacefully, but in 1152 he made what turned out to be the biggest mistake of his life. He abducted Derb Forgail, the wife of another Irish king named Tighernan Ua Ruach. Now, some historians argue this wasn't an abduction at all, but rather an elopement, that Derb Forgail went willingly. Others suggest it was purely political, a way of humiliating a rival. Either way, it kicked off one hell of a feud. Wait, he just took someone else's wife? And thought that would end well? Medieval politics, man. It's like Game of Thrones, but with worse hygiene. This incident sparked a war that eventually pulled in almost every major Irish king. By 1166, Diarmait's enemies had united against him, and he was driven into exile again, this time all the way to England. And that's where things get really interesting, because Diarmait didn't just sulk in exile. He went directly to King Henry II of England and asked for help getting his kingdom back. This sounds like a terrible idea already. You have no idea. Now, Henry II had actually received permission from Pope Adrian IV to invade Ireland back in 1155. The official reason was to reform the Irish Church and bring it more firmly under Rome's control, but obviously the real motivation was territorial expansion. Despite having papal approval, Henry had been too busy with wars in France to actually do anything about Ireland. When Diarmait showed up asking for help, Henry was still tied up in France, but he gave Diarmait permission to recruit soldiers from among the Norman Welsh lords of the Welsh Marches, basically mercenaries who would fight in exchange for land. It was a fateful decision that would change Irish history forever. In May 1169, the first Anglo-Norman force landed in Ireland. It was led by Robert Fitzstephen and was surprisingly small, just about 400 soldiers, but about 100 of them were mounted knights in chainmail, with training and equipment far superior to anything the Irish had. Only 400 guys? That doesn't sound like much of an invasion force. That's exactly what many Irish kings thought too. Big mistake. The knights were the medieval equivalent of tanks. Most Irish warfare was conducted on foot, with lightly armoured troops using spears, axes and swords. They simply had no effective counter to heavily armoured men on horseback. Diarmait brought about 500 Irish warriors of his own to join Fitzstephen's force. They marched north from Wexford, defeating Irish armies one after another. Their first major victory was at Ossory, where they faced the local king, Domhnall MacGilla Patrick. Before the battle, according to chroniclers, Diarmait gave a speech to his Norman allies that ended with, "When Ireland is conquered, I swear by the cross that I shall be content with Leinster alone, and the rest shall be yours." I'm guessing that promise lasted about 5 minutes? You're learning how medieval politics works, but honestly, the Normans probably never believed it anyway. The Irish at Ossory fought bravely but were routed by the Norman knights. What happened next is pretty gruesome. The chronicler Gerald of Wales, who was definitely biased in favour of the Normans but was drawing on eyewitness accounts, described how after the battle, Diarmait found the severed head of an enemy he particularly hated. Recognizing the head, he drew it closer by the hair, which was long and bushy, and gave way to such glee that he convulsed with joy and put the head to his mouth and gnawed the nose and cheeks. Jesus Christ. Yeah, even by medieval standards, that's pretty messed up. Though Gerald might have exaggerated to make the Irish look barbaric, most historians agree something like this probably happened. Diarmait had a reputation for brutality. Within a year, Diarmait, with his Norman allies, had regained control of Leinster. Most Irish kings realised they couldn't stand against the Norman knights, so they entered into negotiations. A treaty was signed at Ferns, according to which Diarmait was recognised as King of Leinster, and in return he would send the Normans back to Wales. But while these negotiations were happening, more Norman troops were already arriving in Ireland. In August 1170, an army of about 1,000 landed, led by Richard de Clare, better known by his nickname Strongbow. Diarmait saw this as his chance to finally become High King of Ireland. He promptly forgot the treaty he'd just signed and formed an alliance with Strongbow, sealed by marrying his daughter Eoif to the Norman Earl. Then their combined forces marched on Dublin and captured the city. The following year, Diarmait died. The chronicles don't specify the cause, but some suggest it was a sudden illness, while others hint he may have been poisoned. Either way, his death created a power vacuum that Strongbow was more than happy to fill. Strongbow claimed the kingdom of Leinster by right of marriage to Diarmait's daughter, Eoif. This was a Norman legal concept that the Irish didn't recognise, but with an army of knights at his back, Strongbow's legal arguments were pretty persuasive. The Irish weren't ready to give up, though. While Strongbow was consolidating his position in Dublin, a coalition of Irish kings laid siege to the city. At the same time, the men of Munster besieged Wexford and actually managed to capture Robert Fitzstephen. For a moment, it looked like the Irish might push the invaders back into the sea. The siege of Dublin lasted 2 months, but eventually Strongbow led a surprise sortie outside the walls and scattered the Irish forces. He then marched south, relieved Wexford, and freed Fitzstephen. Meanwhile, King Henry II had been watching these events with growing concern. Strongbow's success meant that he might establish himself as an independent power in Ireland, potentially even a rival to the English crown. Henry wasn't about to let that happen. In October 1171, Henry II arrived in Ireland with an army of about 4,000 men, the largest military force the island had seen in generations. He landed near Waterford and marched to Dublin. So he's bringing an army to fight Strongbow? That's what many people expected, but it's not how things played out. Strongbow was many things, but he wasn't stupid. When Henry arrived, Strongbow immediately submitted to him, swore fealty as his vassal, and surrendered Dublin and other key towns to royal control. In return, Henry confirmed Strongbow as Lord of Leinster. Henry's arrival wasn't just about checking Strongbow's ambitions, he also wanted to establish his authority over the church in Ireland and to have the Irish kings acknowledge him as their overlord. Surprisingly, most Irish kings did exactly that. One by one, they came to Henry's court, submitted to him, and were confirmed as vassals holding their lands from the English crown. They retained their positions and authority, but now they were, at least technically, subject to Henry. Wait, they just gave up after fighting the Normans for 2 years? It's not that simple. The Irish kings saw Henry as the lesser evil. They were more afraid of Strongbow and other Norman adventurers carving up Ireland into private fiefdoms. By submitting to Henry directly, they hoped to protect their positions against these lesser Norman lords. Plus, Henry offered them a good deal. Keep your lands, keep your titles, just acknowledge me as your overlord and pay some tribute. Many Irish kings probably thought they could agree now and break away later when Henry returned to England. It was a miscalculation. Once the English crown established a foothold in Ireland, it never fully let go. After receiving the submission of most Irish kings, Henry appointed a governor and returned to his continental possessions in early 1172. Hugh de Lacy, an experienced administrator, became the first justiciar of Ireland, essentially the king's representative with extensive powers. So that's it? Ireland is now part of England? Not quite. In fact, what happened next was about 800 years of extremely complicated and often violent history. The initial English control was actually pretty limited. They directly controlled only a small area around Dublin known as the Pale. Outside the Pale, authority was divided between Norman lords like Strongbow, who owed allegiance to the English crown, and native Irish kings who had submitted to Henry but maintained considerable autonomy in practice. This meant that daily life changed dramatically for people living in and around Dublin and other Norman-controlled towns, but remained largely the same for those in more remote areas. If you lived inside a Norman-controlled area, you'd suddenly find yourself subject to feudal law, paying different types of taxes and dealing with foreign lords who often didn't speak your language or understand your customs. The Normans built stone castles, something new to Ireland where fortifications had traditionally been earthworks or wooden structures. These castles were visible symbols of Norman power and transformed the landscape. Norman towns were organised differently too. They established chartered boroughs with stone walls, regular street layouts and legal privileges for citizens. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford and other coastal cities were remodelled along Norman lines. For Irish people living in these areas, some adapted by learning the invaders' languages, Norman French and later English, and adopting their customs. Others resisted culturally, clinging to Irish laws, language and traditions, even while politically submitting to foreign rule. And in the countryside, especially away from the east coast, life went on much as before. The average Irish farmer still lived in a simple dwelling, still grew the same crops and raised the same livestock, still spoke Irish and followed Irish customs. The main difference was that some of their surplus now went to Norman lords rather than Irish kings. But conflicts continued. In 1174, Strongbow attempted to invade Munster, but was defeated at the Battle of Thurles by Irish forces under Donald More O'Brien, King of Thomond. In 1175, Henry signed the Treaty of Windsor with Ruaidhri Ua Conchobar, the last acknowledged High King of Ireland. This treaty divided Ireland into two spheres, the areas under direct Norman control and the areas still ruled by Irish kings. Let me guess, nobody actually stuck to this treaty. Got it in one. The treaty was ignored almost immediately by Norman lords eager to expand their holdings and by Irish kings looking to recover lost territories. In 1177, Henry tried again to strengthen his control by declaring his youngest son John as Lord of Ireland. But John was only 10 years old at the time, so this was mostly a symbolic gesture. When John finally visited Ireland in 1185, at the age of 18, it was a disaster. He insulted the Irish kings who came to pay homage, spent money frivolously, and failed to provide leadership to the Norman lords. After only a few months, he was forced to return to England, having accomplished nothing but making everyone angry. Wow, he sounds like a real charmer. John never quite figured out the whole diplomacy thing, even after he became king following Richard the Lionheart's death, but that's another story. By the time John returned to Ireland in 1210, now as King of England, the situation had deteriorated. Many Norman lords had established themselves as virtually independent powers, while Irish kings continued to resist Norman encroachment. John's second visit was more successful than his first. He forced rebellious Norman lords to submit and built royal castles to strengthen English control. But as soon as he left, the cycle of Norman expansion and Irish resistance resumed. Throughout the 13th century, the English gradually extended their influence in Ireland, capturing more territory and establishing new lordships. The Irish continued to resist, but by 1300, most of the island, particularly the fertile plains, was controlled by Anglo-Norman lords. The Irish kings held onto territory mostly in marginal areas, mountainous regions, boglands and forests where Norman cavalry couldn't operate effectively. During this period, the most powerful Irish dynasty became the O'Neills of Ulster, who would continue to resist English rule longer than any other Irish clan. As night falls on Norman Island, imagine yourself looking out from the walls of Dublin Castle. Below you, the city is changing. Norman French and English are heard in the streets alongside Irish. Stone buildings are rising where wooden structures once stood. Merchants from Bristol, Chester, and even more distant ports haggle in the marketplaces. Ireland is being transformed, but this is just the beginning of a centuries-long struggle. The next major challenge to English power will come from an unexpected direction, Scotland, and that story, the Bruce invasion of Ireland, is where we'll continue next. So, as you settle into your bed in this changing Ireland, with Norman knights patrolling the streets and Irish bards in distant halls singing of resistance, remember how different this is from your comfortable modern bed. No Norman invaders will disturb your sleep tonight. Dawn breaks over a very different Ireland. It's 13:15 and you're in Ulster, the northern province. The morning air carries a bite of early winter chill as you watch strange ships appearing in the distance. Not Vikings this time, Scots. You're about to witness yet another invasion. But this one comes with a twist. These Scots aren't here to conquer Ireland for themselves. They've come as liberators. "Liberators, my ass," mutters an old man beside you. "Just another bunch of foreigners who'll bleed us dry." After years of living under Norman rule, you can't blame him for the scepticism. What's happening is directly connected to events in Scotland. In 1314, a Scottish king named Robert the Bruce had pulled off the impossible, defeating the English at the Battle of Bannockburn and securing Scottish independence. But Robert was smart enough to know that English kings wouldn't just accept the loss, they'd be back. To keep Scotland free, he needed allies, and Ireland seemed like the perfect choice. Both were Celtic nations with a shared hatred of English rule, so his plan was to free Ireland so they could team up against England. Exactly. Robert sent his younger brother, Edward Bruce, with an army of about 5,000 Scottish soldiers to liberate Ireland. The plan was to unite the Irish against their English overlords, push the English out of Ireland completely, and make Edward the High King of Ireland. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, well, let's just say the Irish response was complicated. In May 1315, Edward Bruce's army landed in Ulster. Almost immediately, they scored a victory at the Battle of Connaught, defeating the local English forces. The O'Neill clan of Ulster, one of the most powerful Irish dynasties, decided to support the Scots. So far, so good. Edward Bruce marched south, where he defeated another English army at the Battle of Kells. The Scots seemed unstoppable, but there was a problem. They couldn't hold the territory they captured, so instead of establishing control, they just plundered towns and villages before returning north. Wait, these guys are supposed to be liberators. They're acting an awful lot like raiders. And therein lay the problem. The Scots weren't behaving much better than the English lords they were supposedly driving out. They took food, livestock, and valuables from Irish communities, often the same communities they claimed to be liberating. In 1316, despite the mixed reception, Edward Bruce declared himself High King of Ireland. He had support from some Irish clans, particularly in Ulster, but many others viewed him with suspicion or outright hostility. The Bruce campaign coincided with a period of terrible weather across Europe. Constant rain led to crop failures, and soon famine began to spread. As one Irish chronicler put it, there was scarcely a corner of Ireland where people did not die of starvation. For ordinary people, life became a waking nightmare. Imagine waking up each day not knowing if you'll eat, with your children crying from hunger pains. The chronicles describe people resorting to eating grass, nettles, and even exhuming the recently buried for food. Jesus! I don't even have words. The horror of these years is almost impossible to comprehend, and as famine spread, the Irish increasingly blamed the Scots, whose army was consuming precious resources and disrupting agriculture. I read a transcript from an English court case from this period where a woman testified, "The Scots took our last cow and our seed grain. When my husband protested, they struck him down. Now he cannot work, and we have nothing to plant or eat." Edward Bruce's campaign dragged on for 3 years. By 1318, exhausted by the prolonged war and weakened by famine, the Scots could no longer withstand the English forces, who continued receiving reinforcements from England. In October 1318, the armies met at the Battle of Fowart. The English, led by John de Birmingham, defeated the Scots decisively. Edward Bruce was killed in the fighting, supposedly beheaded with his body quartered and displayed in various Irish towns as a warning. The Bruce invasion was over, leaving Ireland devastated by war and famine. It seemed like nothing would ever drive the English from Ireland, but then came something unexpected, a catastrophe that would rewrite the balance of power across Europe. In 1348, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, reached Ireland's shores. Oh no. Oh yes, and here's where an odd twist of fate occurs. The different lifestyles of the English and Irish settlers played a crucial role during the epidemic. The English lived primarily in towns and cities, while the Irish lived mostly in rural settlements. Since plague spreads fastest in densely populated areas, the English population in Ireland was decimated, while many Irish in isolated rural areas survived. Picture the scene: formerly bustling English towns standing nearly empty, bodies piled in streets, survivors fleeing in terror. Meanwhile, in the Irish countryside, while there was certainly suffering, the impact was less catastrophic. So the plague actually helped the Irish? In a grim way, yes. The Black Death killed between 30 to 50% of Europe's population, but the deaths weren't evenly distributed. By 1360, the English presence in Ireland had contracted dramatically. They controlled little beyond the area around Dublin, which became known as the English Pale. The term "beyond the pale" actually comes from this period. It originally meant outside the area of English law and civilization. These days we use it to describe behaviour that's unacceptable, which tells you a lot about English attitudes toward Irish territories they didn't control. With the English population devastated and their territory reduced, Irish culture began to flourish again. This period, from roughly 1350 to 1500, became known as the Gaelic Revival. Irish language, laws and customs that had been suppressed under Norman rule experienced a resurgence. Many English settlers who remained in Ireland outside the Pale gradually adopted Irish customs, language and laws. They became what later English writers would call more Irish than the Irish themselves. For ordinary people living through the Gaelic Revival, life improved in some ways. There was more autonomy, less taxation, and a return to familiar social structures, but it remained incredibly hard by modern standards. Your home is still that one-room structure, though perhaps slightly larger now. Your bed is still straw or rushes, your clothes are still homespun wool, you still work from dawn to dusk growing crops or tending livestock. The biggest change is that you're now paying tribute to an Irish lord rather than an English one, and you can openly practice Irish customs and speak the Irish language without fear of punishment. The English didn't just accept this contraction of their power. In 1367, they issued the Statutes of Kilkenny, a set of laws that forbade the English in Ireland from adopting Irish language, customs, or dress. Intermarriage between English and Irish was prohibited. English settlers were forbidden from using Irish law. Did that actually work? Not really. Outside the Pale, these laws were basically unenforceable. Inside the Pale, they created a siege mentality among the English settlers, who increasingly saw themselves as an embattled colonial outpost surrounded by hostile natives. In 1394, King Richard II of England decided it was time to reassert English authority in Ireland. He arrived with a substantial army and initially had some success capturing territories in the south and east of the island. These lands were granted to loyal English lords, with the Fitzgerald family, who had been in Ireland since Strongbow's invasion in 1170, receiving the largest share. The Fitzgeralds would become one of the most powerful families in Ireland, known as the Earls of Kildare. Richard II's second campaign in Ireland, however, was far less successful. While he was in Ireland, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke seized the English throne. Richard had to rush back to England, where he was eventually captured and died in prison. Throughout the 15th century, the English crown had little focus on Ireland. First, they were preoccupied with the renewed conflict of the 100 Years' War against France. Later, England was torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York for control of the English throne. During this civil war, the English lords in Ireland mostly supported the House of York. When the Tudors, from the House of Lancaster, eventually won the war and seized the English throne, Ireland became a launchpad for rebellions against the new dynasty. I found an account from 1487 where an English official complained the wild Irish and the degenerate English who had adopted Irish ways together make common cause against the crown. They speak Irish, follow Irish customs, and acknowledge no law but that of the Brehons, Irish judges. By the early 16th century, English control in Ireland had deteriorated to its weakest point since the initial invasion. An official report from 1515 stated, "The King's laws are obeyed and executed in only 4 shires, Dublin, Meath, Louth and Kildare." The rest of Ireland was controlled either by wild Irish chieftains who called themselves kings or by degenerate English lords who had essentially gone native. Both groups operated independently, making war or peace without asking permission from the English crown. So, after all that, the English basically lost most of Ireland? For a time, yes. But this period of Irish resurgence was about to come to a crashing end because England itself had changed. Under the Tudors, it had become a centralised state with the king wielding nearly absolute power, and the new king, Henry VIII, had grand ambitions for Ireland. By evening, you're sitting by the fire in a small Irish village beyond the Pale. Life here follows ancient rhythms, the seasons, the agricultural calendar, the festival days that have been celebrated for centuries. An old storyteller entertains the gathered villagers with tales of ancient heroes, Cú Chulainn, Finn MacCool, the children of Lear. These stories connect you to a past that stretches back before Vikings, before Normans, before the English. Children listen wide-eyed as the storyteller describes epic cattle raids and magical battles. Adults nod appreciatively at familiar tales they've heard since childhood. For a moment, it almost feels like nothing has changed in 1,000 years. But change is coming, more dramatic than anything Ireland has experienced before, because across the Irish Sea, a new English king is preparing to do what no previous English monarch managed, to bring the entire island of Ireland under his direct control. Henry VIII isn't just another English king making territorial claims, he's a new kind of monarch with unprecedented power, determination, and a revolutionary agenda that will transform both England and Ireland forever. As night falls and you prepare for sleep, there's a sense of foreboding in the air. The relative autonomy enjoyed during the Gaelic revival is drawing to a close. The English are coming back, and this time they won't settle for controlling just the Pale. Unlike you in your modern bed with heating and air conditioning, medieval Irish people were intimately connected to the rhythms of nature. As you drift off to sleep on your straw mattress, you can hear the autumn wind rustling through the thatch, carrying the first hint of winter's chill. Outside, a wolf howls in the distance, one of the many that still roamed Ireland's forests. Soon they'll be gone too, along with so much else of old Ireland. The Tudor reconquest is about to begin, and it will change the island forever. Morning mist clings to the green hills as you open your eyes. The year is 1534, and everything about Ireland is about to change. Again. You've heard whispers about the English king across the water, Henry VIII. Unlike previous English monarchs who were often distracted by wars in France or internal conflicts, this one seems dead set on bringing Ireland fully under his control. He split with the Pope, an old woman tells you as you collect water from the village well. Divorced his wife and married another. They say he's breaking up all the monasteries in England and taking their wealth for himself. Religious revolution in England is sending shockwaves across the Irish Sea. For centuries, despite political differences, both Irish and English shared the same Catholic faith. Now that's changing too. But before we dive into Henry's grand plans for Ireland, let's talk about the Fitzgerald family, because they're about to trigger one hell of a crisis. Remember the Fitzgeralds? They'd been in Ireland since the original Norman invasion and had become one of the most powerful families on the island. By the 1500s, they were Earls of Kildare and effectively ruled much of Ireland as the king's deputies. Gerald Fitzgerald, the 9th Earl of Kildare, was Lord Deputy of Ireland, basically the King's representative, but Gerald, like many Anglo-Irish lords, had gone semi-native. He married into Irish families, spoke the Irish language, and often ignored orders from London. So, this guy was supposed to represent the King, but just did whatever he wanted? Pretty much, Gerald fought against Irish clans when it suited him, but also made alliances with them against rival English lords. He ruled like a king in all but name. Naturally, this didn't sit well with Henry VIII, who was all about centralised royal authority. In 1526, Gerald was summoned to London and imprisoned in the Tower for 4 years. Eventually, he was released and allowed to return to Ireland. But in 1534, he was summoned to London again. This time, he never came back. He died in the Tower the following year. While Gerald was imprisoned, his son, Thomas Fitzgerald, was left in charge of the family holdings. Thomas was known as Silken Thomas because of his fancy clothing and the silk fringes his horsemen wore on their helmets. When Thomas heard rumours that his father had been executed in the Tower, which wasn't actually true yet, he snapped. In a dramatic scene at St Mary's Abbey in Dublin, he renounced his allegiance to Henry VIII. According to chronicles, Thomas threw the sword of state, the symbol of royal authority, on the council table and declared, "This sword of state is yours, not mine. I have need of my own sword now. I am none of Henry's deputy. I am his foe. Talk about burning bridges." Oh, he was just getting started. Thomas raised an army and declared himself King of Ireland. His forces quickly seized control of Dublin and most of the Pale. It was an outright rebellion against the Tudor monarchy. I found an account from a merchant in Dublin who wrote, "The city is in terror. Fitzgerald's men patrol the streets, and none dare speak against them. Those known to favour the king have fled or hidden themselves away." But Thomas's rebellion had a fatal flaw. He couldn't capture Dublin Castle, the centre of English power in Ireland. Without it, his control of Dublin was tenuous at best. Meanwhile, Henry VIII dispatched a new army to Ireland under Sir William Skeffington. They landed in October 1534 and began methodically reclaiming territory. Thomas hoped to gain support from the native Irish chieftains, but most were reluctant to join his cause. They had no particular love for the Fitzgeralds, who had fought against them as often as with them over the centuries, so they just sat it out? Mostly, yes. Some even sided with the royal forces, seeing an opportunity to settle old scores with the Fitzgeralds. By 1535, Thomas had suffered several defeats. In March, he failed to take Dublin Castle again, and royal forces began to recapture the Pale. In July, Skeffington besieged the Fitzgerald family's main stronghold at Maynooth Castle. The castle was considered nearly impregnable, but the English brought something new to Ireland: heavy artillery. After just 10 days of bombardment, the walls were breached, and the castle fell. What happened next became infamous as the Pardon of Maynooth. The garrison surrendered, expecting to be treated as prisoners of war. Instead, Skeffington ordered all of them executed, about 25-30 men, including priests and civilians who had taken refuge in the castle. Jesus! That's cold! It was deliberate psychological warfare. Henry VIII was sending a message. Resistance would be met with unprecedented brutality. The tactic worked. After Maynooth fell, Thomas Fitzgerald's rebellion collapsed. By August 1535, he surrendered to Lord Leonard Grey, the king's new deputy. Thomas was sent to the Tower of London, where he was executed in February 1537, along with 5 of his uncles. The Fitzgerald rebellion had failed completely, but its consequences were enormous. Henry VIII used it as justification to fundamentally transform the relationship between England and Ireland. Unlike previous English kings who were content to rule through loyal lords, Henry wanted direct control. He dispatched royal officials to systematically extend English authority across the entire island. But Henry was clever. Rather than trying to conquer Ireland purely through military force, which had never worked well, he developed a new policy called surrender and regrant. Surrender and regrant sounds like some boring legal thing. The name's dull, but the concept was revolutionary. Here's how it worked. Irish chieftains would surrender their lands to the king, renounce their Gaelic titles, like the O'Neill or the McMurrough, and abandon Brehon law, the traditional Irish legal system. In return, the king would grant them the same lands back as hereditary estates under English law, along with English titles like Earl or Baron. They'd become landlords rather than clan leaders. This completely transformed the nature of Irish society. Under Brehon law, a chieftain didn't personally own his clan's territory. He was more like a trustee managing it for the benefit of the entire clan. Land belonged to the community, not individuals. Under English law, these newly minted lords now owned their lands personally and could sell them, rent them out, or do whatever they wanted with them. The clan members who had previously had traditional rights to the land suddenly became tenants with far fewer protections. I read a transcript from an Irish court case decades later where an elderly man testified, "In my grandfather's time, the land belonged to all of us. Now it belongs only to the Lord, and we must pay whatever rent he demands or be thrown out." So the chieftains basically sold out their own people. Many did. Yes, the offer was too tempting to refuse. They got to keep their lands, gained new prestigious titles, and often increased their personal power, even if it meant undermining the traditional clan system. Some of Ireland's most powerful Gaelic dynasties accepted these terms. The O'Neills became Earls of Tyrone, the O'Briens became Earls of Thomond, and the MacWilliam Burkes, who were originally of English descent but had assimilated, became Earls of Clanricarde. For ordinary people living through this transformation, it was a mixed experience. If your chieftain accepted surrender and regrant, your daily life might initially continue much as before, but gradually you'd notice changes. The old clan gatherings might happen less frequently. Your local Brehon judge might be replaced by an English-style court. Your chieftain, now an earl, might start building an English-style manor house instead of living in the traditional Irish way. Most significantly, the reciprocal obligations that had balanced clan society began to erode. Traditionally, a chieftain had responsibilities toward his people as much as they had toward him. Under the new system, these mutual obligations weakened, replaced by a more straightforward landlord-tenant relationship. By evening, you're sitting with neighbours discussing the changes sweeping across Ireland. An old man who travelled to Dublin recently described seeing the Lord Deputy riding through the streets in grand procession, surrounded by English soldiers. "They're building a new Ireland," he says, "and there's no place in it for the old ways." As darkness falls, you wonder what these changes mean for your children and grandchildren. Will they speak Irish or English? Will they follow Brehon law or English common law? Will they even remember the old stories and traditions? The transformation accelerated in 1541 when Henry VIII had the Irish Parliament declare him King of Ireland. Previously, English monarchs had technically been Lords of Ireland, a title granted by the Pope to Henry II back in 1171. By declaring himself king, Henry VIII asserted that his authority came directly from his royal sovereignty, not from papal grant. This might seem like just a change in title, but it had profound implications. As King of Ireland, Henry claimed the entire island as his royal domain. No part of Ireland, no matter how remote, was beyond his authority. So he just claimed the whole country, and that worked? Not immediately or completely, no. But it established the legal basis for everything that followed. Over the next century, English authority would gradually extend into even the most Gaelic regions of Ireland. To solidify his control, Henry established a network of garrisons across Ireland and began a policy of plantation, settling loyal English subjects on confiscated Irish lands. This would become a major pattern in Irish history over the next century. For Henry, Ireland was now a personal kingdom, just like England. He was determined to rule it directly rather than through semi-independent lords, as his predecessors had done. The process wasn't always violent. Many Irish chieftains came to Dublin Castle voluntarily to submit to the king. They were received with elaborate ceremony, given fine English clothes, and sent home with new titles and royal charters confirming their lands. But violence was always lurking beneath the surface. Those who resisted faced military campaigns, confiscation, and potentially execution for treason. I interviewed an archaeologist who specialises in Tudor Ireland, and she told me this period fundamentally changed Ireland's trajectory. English systems of law, property and governance were imposed in a way that couldn't be reversed. It wasn't just political control, it was cultural and social engineering. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, the transformation of Ireland was well underway. His children, Edward VI, Mary I, and especially Elizabeth I, would continue and intensify his policies. For ordinary Irish people, life became increasingly regulated by English systems and increasingly vulnerable to English intervention. If you lived in or near areas directly controlled by the English, you faced pressure to adopt English language, customs, and religion. If you lived in more remote areas under Gaelic lords who had submitted to the crown, changes came more gradually. Your lord might still speak Irish and maintain some traditional practices, but his legal authority now came from the English crown, not from traditional Gaelic sovereignty. As night falls completely, you lie on your bed of straw in your simple home. The fire has burned down to embers, casting a soft glow across the room. Outside, you can hear the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a night bird. Your world is changing in ways that will never be reversed. The old Ireland, the island of high kings and Brehon laws, of cattle raids and poet prophets, is fading away. A new Ireland, shaped by Tudor power and policy, is emerging. Yet as you drift towards sleep, there's one comfort. The land itself remains. The same hills, the same rivers, the same changing skies that your ancestors knew. Whatever happens with kings and laws and titles, this endures. Unlike your comfortable modern bed with its memory foam and temperature control, a medieval Irish person had to find comfort in simplicity. The warmth of woolen blankets, the soft crackling of dying embers, the knowledge that some things remain constant even in times of great change. As Henry VIII's new order takes shape across Ireland, transforming ancient kingdoms into English-style counties and chieftains into earls, we'll continue our story next with the religious dimension of this conflict, because the Reformation is about to add fuel to an already complex situation. The morning fog is thick enough to cut with a knife as you make your way to the village church. It's a Sunday in the 1570s, and church attendance isn't just about faith anymore, it's become political. Queen Elizabeth I has been on the English throne for over a decade now. Unlike her sister Mary, who briefly restored Catholicism to England, Elizabeth is firmly Protestant and expects her Irish subjects to follow suit. "You coming to service?" asks a neighbour, eyeing you warily. "Of course," you reply, though you both know many in the village still attend secret Catholic masses held in remote locations by priests hiding from English authorities. Religion has added an explosive new dimension to the already complex relationship between Ireland and England. When Henry VIII broke with Rome and established the Church of England, he expected Ireland to simply follow along. But while the English settlers and some Anglo-Irish lords accepted the new Protestant faith, the vast majority of Irish remained staunchly Catholic. It wasn't just about religion, a historian once told me. For many Irish, Catholicism became a way to resist English cultural and political domination. Rejecting Protestantism was rejecting English rule. Elizabeth's religious policies in Ireland were strategically pragmatic at first. During the early years of her reign, she didn't aggressively push Protestantism in Ireland. She was more concerned with establishing political control and didn't want religious issues complicating that effort. But as her reign progressed, religious conformity became increasingly important. Protestant bishops were appointed to Irish dioceses, laws were passed requiring attendance at Protestant services, Catholic practices were officially banned. For ordinary Irish people, this created a painful dilemma. Do you publicly conform to the new religion to avoid fines or imprisonment while secretly maintaining Catholic practices, or do you openly defy the law and face the consequences? Many chose a middle path, what one contemporary observer called church papists. They would attend Protestant services as legally required, but continue practicing Catholicism in private. I read an account from an English official in Cork who complained, "They come to church with their bodies but leave their hearts at home. They stand as statues while our service is read, but if a priest says Mass in a cave, they will travel 20 miles through the night to attend." By midday, you're working in the fields, careful to avoid discussion of the morning's church service with anyone you don't fully trust. Religious division has made everyone cautious about what they say and to whom. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was methodically extending English control throughout Ireland. Unlike her father, who relied heavily on the surrender and re-grant policy, Elizabeth favoured a more direct approach, military conquest followed by plantation. Plantation, like growing crops? No, though it was about seeds of a sort. Plantation meant confiscating land from Irish owners and planting it with loyal English or Scottish settlers. It was colonisation, plain and simple. The first major plantation under Elizabeth occurred in Munster after the Desmond rebellions. These were uprisings led by the Fitzgerald Earls of Desmond, a different branch than the Fitzgeralds of Kildare we discussed earlier. The Second Desmond Rebellion, 1579-1583, was particularly brutal. English forces under Lord Grey de Wilton adopted a deliberate policy of creating famine to defeat the rebels. Wait, they intentionally caused a famine? How? They systematically destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock, and burned food stores across Munster. The strategy was to make it impossible for rebels to feed themselves or their supporters. An English officer named Thomas Churchyard described the aftermath. The soldiers did not leave a man, woman, or child alive in any area where resistance was found, nor did they leave any food, cattle, or crops that might sustain human life. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the province of Munster lay in ruins. Contemporary accounts describe people dying of starvation by the thousands. Some were found with green stains around their mouths from eating grass in desperate attempts to survive. The Fitzgerald Earl of Desmond was killed, his head cut off and sent to London as a trophy. His lands, over 500,000 acres, were confiscated and distributed to English colonists as the Munster Plantation. So they starved an entire province, then stole all the land. That's the grim reality of it, yes. For ordinary Irish people in Munster, this meant not only losing their homes, but also becoming tenants on land their families had held for generations. Many were reduced to working as labourers for the new English landowners. I visited a museum in Cork once where they have letters from this period. One was from an English settler who wrote, "The Irish who remain are much subdued. They make good workers when supervised properly, though they hold to their papist ways in secret." As afternoon wears on, you finish your work in the fields and head home. You pass an English patrol on the road, a reminder that you live in occupied territory. They barely glance at you. To them, you're just another Irish peasant, not worth attention unless causing trouble. Home is still that simple one-room structure, though some changes are visible. The wealthy English settlers are building new-style houses with glass windows and chimneys. Some prosperous Irish are starting to copy these features when they can afford to. Your dinner is still simple. Perhaps oaten bread, some cheese, and maybe a bit of salted fish. For the English settlers and officials, tables are laden with roasted meats, imported wines, and delicacies from England. While the Munster Plantation was devastating, it was just a prelude to the largest and most significant conflict of Elizabethan Ireland, the 9 Years' War. This war centred around Ulster, the northernmost province of Ireland. Unlike other parts of Ireland, Ulster had remained largely outside direct English control. The most powerful Gaelic lord in Ulster was Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. Now, here's an interesting character for you. O'Neill had actually been raised in England, was fluent in English, and initially seemed to be a model of the assimilated Irish lord. Queen Elizabeth and her advisers thought he was firmly in their camp. Sounds like they misread that situation. Spectacularly so. O'Neill was playing a long game. While outwardly loyal to the crown, he was secretly building alliances with other Irish lords and even communicating with England's Catholic enemies, Spain. By 1595, O'Neill felt strong enough to openly rebel. He allied with another northern lord, Hugh O'Donnell of Tyrconnell, and they achieved a series of stunning victories against English forces. The most famous of these was the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598, where O'Neill's forces annihilated an English army of over 4,000 men. It was one of the worst defeats English forces ever suffered in Ireland. O'Neill wasn't just a skilled military leader, he was politically savvy too. He framed his rebellion as a Catholic crusade against Protestant England, which helped him gain support from Spain and the papacy. For ordinary Irish people, O'Neill became a symbol of resistance against English rule. Songs and poems celebrated his victories. Some saw him as the potential saviour of Gaelic Ireland. So it looked like the Irish might actually win this one. For a time, yes. O'Neill controlled most of Northern Ireland, and his allies rose up across the country. The English position looked genuinely precarious. But Elizabeth I responded by sending her largest army ever to Ireland, over 17,000 men under the command of Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy. Mountjoy was a different calibre of commander than previous English leaders in Ireland. He established a network of garrisons to limit O'Neill's movement, used naval power to block Spanish aid, and adopted the same scorched earth tactics that had worked in Munster. An Irish chronicler described how Mountjoy's forces cut down the corn while it was still green, burned the houses and villages, and drove off every cow, sheep and goat for 20 miles around their path. By evening, sitting around your hearth, you hear whispered news brought by a traveller. Spanish ships have landed at Kinsale in the south to help O'Neill. There's excitement in these hushed conversations. Could this be the moment when the English are finally driven out? The traveller describes how O'Neill and O'Donnell are marching their armies south to link up with the Spanish forces. If they succeed, the combined Catholic army might be strong enough to break English power in Ireland for good. But winter is coming, and the journey south is long and difficult. The northern armies will be exhausted by the time they reach Kinsale, and Mountjoy is already moving to besiege the Spanish before they can join forces with their Irish allies. On December 24th, 1601, the armies met at the Battle of Kinsale. It should have been a strong position for the Irish. They had the English surrounded between their forces and the Spanish in the town. But military historians tell us O'Neill made an uncharacteristic error. Instead of waiting for the English to be weakened by winter conditions and lack of supplies, he opted for a direct assault. It proved disastrous. The battle quickly turned into a rout. Thousands of Irish soldiers were killed and the survivors fled back to Ulster. The Spanish in Kinsale surrendered and were allowed to return to Spain. For ordinary Irish people, the defeat at Kinsale was devastating. One contemporary account describes how a great sorrow fell upon the Irish of Ireland, for the hope of Ireland's deliverance was lost. So that was it? Game over? Not immediately. O'Neill continued resistance for another year and a half, but his position grew steadily weaker. Finally, in March 1603, he surrendered to Mountjoy at Mellifont. Just days before O'Neill's surrender, though neither side knew it yet, Queen Elizabeth had died. James VI of Scotland had succeeded her as James I of England. It was the end of the Tudor dynasty. Under the terms of surrender, O'Neill was surprisingly well treated. He kept his lands and his title as Earl of Tyrone. He had to renounce any foreign allegiances and swear loyalty to the English crown, but otherwise his position seemed secure. For a few years, an uneasy peace held in Ulster, but O'Neill and other Irish lords found their power steadily eroded under the new Stuart monarchy. English officials interfered more and more in their affairs. Legal cases went against them. Protestant settlers continued to arrive in their territories. In September 1607, O'Neill, along with the Earl of Tyrconnell and about 90 other Irish nobles and their families, boarded ships and sailed for continental Europe. They hoped to secure Spanish support for a new rebellion and return to Ireland with a foreign army. It never happened. The exiled earls spent the rest of their lives in Rome, never seeing Ireland again. This event became known as the Flight of the Earls, and it marked the effective end of the old Gaelic aristocracy in Ireland. With the Earls gone, the English crown declared their lands forfeit. This created the opportunity for the largest and most consequential plantation of all, the plantation of Ulster. Over the next few years, hundreds of thousands of acres in Ulster were confiscated and distributed to new settlers, primarily from Scotland and England. Unlike previous plantations, which had focused on bringing over wealthy landowners, the Ulster plantation brought thousands of ordinary British tenants to farm the land. This created an entirely new dynamic in Ireland, a large population of Protestant settlers who had no interest in assimilating into Irish culture or converting to Catholicism. Their loyalty was to Britain, and they viewed the native Irish with suspicion and often contempt. So, this is where the whole Northern Ireland situation begins? Exactly. The Ulster plantation laid the foundation for centuries of sectarian division that continues to affect Northern Ireland to this day. As night falls, you listen to an old man in your village sing a lament for the departed earls. The song speaks of eagles flying from their nests, never to return, and of Ireland left defenceless against its enemies. There's a sense of profound loss in the music, not just for specific individuals, but for an entire way of life that's disappearing. The old Gaelic world of clan loyalties, Bréan laws, and native traditions is giving way to an island increasingly shaped by English law, language, and customs. Tomorrow, you'll wake to a changed Ireland. The flight of the Earls and subsequent Ulster plantation marks the effective end of Gaelic Ireland as a political entity. From now on, Ireland's story becomes increasingly one of colonisation, resistance, and the complex interplay between native Irish and settler communities. As you drift towards sleep on your simple bed, so different from your modern mattress with its perfectly engineered support, you might wonder what happens next in Ireland's story. The 17th century would bring even more dramatic changes. Civil war in England with profound repercussions for Ireland, the rise of Oliver Cromwell, and one of the most traumatic periods in Irish history. But that's where we'll pick up next, as Ireland enters one of its darkest chapters, followed by the dawn of a new era of resistance and the slow, painful birth of modern Irish identity. Dawn breaks over a troubled island. It's 1641, and Ireland is a powder keg about to explode. You wake to urgent knocking on your door. A neighbour stands there, breathless with news. "It's happened," he says. "The Irish have risen up. They're attacking the English settlements in Ulster." The 1641 rebellion has begun. One of the most consequential events in Irish history, though not for the reasons anyone expected at the time. After the flight of the Earls and the plantation of Ulster, tensions had been building steadily. Native Irish Catholics had lost vast tracts of land to Protestant settlers. Religious persecution had intensified. Economic opportunities for Catholics had steadily diminished under increasingly restrictive laws. So they finally snapped? Essentially, yes. But there was also a strategic element. In England, King Charles I was locked in a power struggle with Parliament. Many Irish Catholics believed that Charles was sympathetic to their plight, and that by rising against the Puritan settlers in Ulster, they were actually supporting the king against his parliamentary enemies. The rebellion began in Ulster under the leadership of Sir Phelim O'Neill, a relative of the earlier Hugh O'Neill. The initial plan was for a coordinated takeover of key strongholds with minimal bloodshed, but once started, the rebellion quickly spiralled out of control. Protestant settlers, caught completely by surprise, were driven from their homes. Thousands fled to walled towns for safety. Many were killed. Exactly how many became a matter of fierce historical debate. I'm guessing the English version and Irish version of what happened differ a bit. That's putting it mildly. English accounts claimed a wholesale massacre of Protestants. One widely circulated report put the death toll at over 150,000, more than the entire Protestant population of Ireland at the time. Modern historians estimate the actual death toll was probably around 4,000 Protestants killed directly, with perhaps another 8,000 dying from exposure and starvation after being driven from their homes in winter. But accuracy wasn't the point of those early reports. They were propaganda, designed to inflame Protestant opinion against Irish Catholics. And they worked spectacularly well. I saw a collection of pamphlets from this period in a museum once. The illustrations depicted Irish rebels as literal monsters committing unspeakable atrocities against innocent Protestant families. One headline screamed, "The barbarous cruelty of the bloody Irish rebels." These accounts, wildly exaggerated though they were, shaped English perceptions of the Irish for generations. They also provided justification for what came next. The rebellion quickly spread beyond Ulster to other parts of Ireland. In 1642, Catholic nobles and clergy formed the Confederation of Kilkenny, essentially an alternative Irish government that controlled most of the island outside the areas held by Protestant settlers. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Irish Catholics might actually succeed in taking back control of their country, but their timing couldn't have been worse. By midday, you're huddled with neighbours, discussing rumours that swirl like autumn leaves. Civil war has broken out in England between King Charles and Parliament. Scotland has been drawn into the conflict. No one knows what this means for Ireland, but everyone agrees it can't be good. England's distracted by its own problems, an optimistic young man suggests. Maybe they'll leave us alone now. An older woman snorts in derision. When have the English ever left us alone? She's right to be sceptical. The English Civil War didn't mean Ireland would be forgotten. Quite the opposite. For nearly a decade, Ireland became a complex battleground with multiple factions: the Catholic Confederates, Royalists loyal to King Charles, Scottish Covenanters and English parliamentarians. Alliances shifted constantly, and ordinary people suffered regardless of who was temporarily winning. Then in 1649, the English Civil War ended, with King Charles III executed and Oliver Cromwell emerging as the leader of the new Commonwealth. Cromwell turned his attention to Ireland, where Royalist forces and Catholic Confederates had allied in support of Charles II, the executed king's son. Cromwell landed in Ireland in August 1649 with an army of 12,000 veteran soldiers. What followed was one of the most brutal military campaigns in Irish history. I've heard Cromwell was bad news for Ireland. That's like saying a hurricane is a bit of wind. Cromwell is probably the most hated figure in Irish history, and for good reason. His campaign began at Drogheda, where his forces stormed the town and killed nearly every defender. Around 2,800 people. Cromwell himself justified this in religious terms, writing that it was a righteous judgment of God and would prevent the effusion of blood for the future. Similar massacres followed at Wexford and other towns. Cromwell's forces swept across Ireland with ruthless efficiency. By the time he returned to England in May 1650, most organised resistance had been crushed. The aftermath was even worse than the campaign itself. The Cromwellian settlement of Ireland involved the most extensive land confiscation yet. Catholic landowners were forced to surrender their land in Eastern Ireland and were transplanted to poorer lands in the western province of Connaught. A contemporary slogan summed up the policy: to hell or to Connaught. Catholics had to choose between accepting inferior land in the West or leaving the country entirely. I found a letter from this period written by an Irish landowner who had fought against Cromwell. He described arriving in Connaught with his family after being forced from his ancestral estate. "The land here is little more than rock and bog. My children cry for hunger. My wife grows thin and pale. This is a slow death they have sentenced us to." For ordinary Irish Catholics, the Cromwellian period was catastrophic. Some historians estimate that between war, famine and disease, Ireland's population fell from around 1.5 million in 1641 to perhaps 850,000 by 1652, a demographic collapse of over 40%. The land confiscations were equally dramatic. Before 1641, Catholics had owned around 60% of land in Ireland. By the 1650s, this had fallen to just 20%, and most of that was poor quality land in the West. So the Irish lost basically everything: pretty much. And remember, this wasn't just about property. Land ownership in this period determined political rights, social status, and economic opportunity. The dispossession of Catholic landowners created a nearly complete overlap between religious identity and economic class. Catholics became almost universally poor, while Protestants controlled wealth and power. By evening, sitting around your hearth, an old man who has lived through these tumultuous times shares his memories. "I've seen the old Gaelic lords flee to Europe," he says. "I've seen plantations take our best land. I've seen Cromwell's men kill without mercy, and still we endure." He's right. Despite everything, Irish culture persisted. The Irish language continued to be spoken, especially in rural areas. Traditional music, storytelling, and customs survived, though increasingly pushed to the margins. The Cromwellian settlement wasn't the end of Ireland's troubles in the 17th century. After the restoration of the monarchy in England with Charles II in 1660, there was a brief period of relative stability. Some Catholic landowners even managed to regain their properties through legal challenges. But the accession of the Catholic King James II in 1685 set the stage for another crisis. James appointed Catholics to key positions in Ireland, alarming the Protestant community. When he was overthrown in England by William of Orange in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Ireland again became a battlefield for English power struggles. James fled to Ireland, where he rallied Catholic support. The conflict that followed, the Williamite War, culminated in the famous Battle of the Boyne in 1690, where William's forces defeated James. Isn't that the battle that's still celebrated by some people in Northern Ireland? Exactly. The Battle of the Boyne remains a powerful symbol in Irish sectarian divisions to this day. Orange Order marches on the 12th of July commemorate William's victory, often causing tensions in Northern Ireland. William's victory was followed by the imposition of the penal laws, a comprehensive system of legal restrictions on Catholics and, to a lesser extent, Presbyterian dissenters. A Catholic landowner couldn't even pass his entire estate to his eldest son if that son remained Catholic. The estate had to be divided equally among all sons, a practice that gradually fragmented Catholic holdings into ever smaller parcels. Edmund Burke, the Irish-born British statesman, later described the penal laws as a machine of wise and elaborate contrivance, as well fitted for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people, and the debasement in them of human nature itself, as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man. This is honestly depressing as hell. It was a dark time. By the early 18th century, the native Irish had been reduced to a subject population in their own land. They had lost their political autonomy, most of their land, their religious freedom, and many of their cultural institutions. The great Gaelic aristocratic families were gone, either extinct, exiled to continental Europe, or reduced to poverty. The Irish language, once spoken across the island, was increasingly confined to rural areas and associated with poverty and backwardness. As night falls on this island of dispossession and defeat, you might wonder if this is where the story ends. With Ireland firmly under English control, its native population subjugated, its culture in retreat. But that's not how history works. Even in the darkest times, seeds of change are being planted. In the 18th century, a new form of Irish resistance would emerge, not led by Gaelic chieftains or Catholic nobles, but by middle-class intellectuals, agrarian secret societies, and eventually revolutionary republicans inspired by the American and French revolutions. The struggle would evolve from one primarily about religion and land to one increasingly focused on national identity and political rights. The concept of Irish nationalism, as we understand it today, largely emerged from this period.